Someone, I can't remember who it was, it might have been one of you, someone was telling me recently of their trip to Alton Towers, and I was just exhausted listening to them. It was simply literally one roller coaster to the next. And by the end of the conversation I thought, golly. And you know, I feel a bit like that about the book of Exodus over the last few weeks. Believe it or not, it is our 9th visit to the book of Exodus. We're going to have one more, and then we're going to take a bit of a pause. But I feel that Exodus has been a real roller coaster in terms of activity. You remember right back to the beginning, there were those ruthless Egyptian slave drivers against the Israelites. Then Pharaoh ordering all the little boys to be killed at birth. Moses being hidden in the bulrushes. Later on, Moses killing that Egyptian and having to flee the country. God appearing in the burning bush, or the bush that didn't actually burn. Moses' staff, his stick that turned into a snake. Pharaoh's hardness of heart, those terrible plagues of blood and frogs and gnats and flies, and the darkness that covered the land for 3 days. The death of all the firstborn, that terrible last plague. But the Passover, the Israelites could have a lamb that died so that they didn't have to. And then leaving their homes, pursued by a massive army of chariots and horsemen, and then they became trapped up against the Red Sea, but they miraculously passed through the Red Sea and their enemy was finally destroyed. Into the desert they went, and how they grumbled and moaned against Moses, against God. Water in the wilderness, manna in the wilderness, frosties, quail in the wilderness. 2 weeks ago, the Amalekites, military opposition in the wilderness, roller coaster, exhausting. And now we hit Exodus 18, where there is this very simple story of Moses meeting up with this old guy called Jethro and them having a meal in the desert. And this just feels so out of place. Interestingly, many of the commentaries, the books about the Bible, just miss these chapters out. They can't find anything interesting in here particularly to comment about. Because we look ahead and we see more exciting things. We see Mount Sinai, we see the 10 Commandments, we see the tabernacle's coming up. And of course eventually we're looking for entry into the promised land. And we think to ourselves, what is this doing here? It just feels a bit flat. It feels a bit of an anticlimax. My 2 headings this morning: an outsider becomes an insider, and a people taste heaven. An outsider becomes an insider. Let's look again at what Moses tells us. Verse 1, now Jethro, the priest of Midian and father-in-law of Moses, heard of everything God had done for Moses and for his people Israel, and how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. After Moses had sent away his wife Zipporah, his father-in-law Jethro received her and her 2 sons. One son was named Gershom, for Moses said, I become a foreigner in a foreign land. And the other was named Eliza, for he said, my father's God was my helper. He saved me from the sword of Pharaoh. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, together with Moses' son and wife, came to him in the wilderness where he was camped near the mountain of God. Jethro had sent word to him, I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons. We remember, don't we, decades before, when Moses had fled from Egypt, he married a girl called Zipporah, daughter of a shepherd called Jethro, who was also a priest in the land of Midian. Let's very quickly imagine a map, modern day Egypt, which is of course Africa, and then up to the right you've got the Sinai Peninsula, and if you go up you end up in Israel, but if you go that way you end up in Saudi Arabia. That's where we are. Midian is modern day Saudi Arabia. Jethro was a priest in Midian. Human beings, men, women, children, they've always sought things to worship, haven't they? All of us, we've always sought something outside of ourselves to live for, to give us meaning and significance and purpose. I remember 2 or 3 years ago, Sarah and I and Lottie, we went on holiday to Montenegro, that little Balkan country on the Adriatic. One late afternoon, I remember us wandering down to the beach. I think it was a Saturday, and the beach was really quite crowded. Late afternoon, and suddenly, I think it was pretty much the whole beach, but loads and loads and loads of people suddenly, with no warning, they all just got to their feet, and they stood there, motionless, staring at the setting sun. It was actually a bit freaky. And Sarah and I sort of looked at each other and said, what's happening? What are they doing? And we're pretty sure that they were literally worshipping the sun. Now what would God say to that? What would God say to this? Well, surely he would say to them, no, you're missing something. The sun was made by me. The sun is extraordinarily powerful. The sun is extraordinarily good. But the sun, that sun, doesn't love you. The sun doesn't have a personality. The sun is not a person. It's me, your maker, who made you individually with a purpose for a purpose. It's me who made everything with a purpose for a purpose. Don't start worshipping things, even the sun. Don't look to things. Don't chase things, even the sun. Look to me. That's what God would say, isn't it? Jethro was a priest in his home country, and he was a worshipper, but it wasn't God he worshipped. It wasn't the God who made him, the God who made everyone, the God who we know to have revealed himself in the scriptures, the God who ultimately reveals himself in Jesus. It wasn't God he was worshipping. I personally, I do find it really, really helpful to sometimes ask myself the question, who or what am I tempted to worship? What do I long to have? What could I not bear to be without? Who could I not bear to be without? What does my use of time and money and energy show me about what I really care about? What are the false gods in my life? Jethro was a worshipper, but he wasn't a worshipper of God. And maybe that's you, or at least a bit of you. Because I'm constantly discovering it's still a bit of me. So whilst Moses was in Egypt, it seemed that he sent his wife and his children off to be with Grandpa Jethro. And now they return. So we've got Grandpa Jethro, and we've got Moses' wife, and we've got the grandchildren. I put this on the notice sheet. I've pinpointed 4 things that I think happened to Grandpa Jethro. He heard, he delighted, he acknowledged, he submitted. See if you can spot those as we read together. Verse 5. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, together with Moses' son and wife, came to him in the wilderness where he was camped near the mountain of God. Jethro had sent word to him, I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons. So Moses went out to meet his father-in-law and bowed down and kissed him. They greeted each other and then went into the tent. Moses told his father-in-law about everything the Lord had done to Pharaoh and the Egyptians for Israel's sake, and about all the hardships they'd met along the way and how the Lord had saved them. Jethro was delighted to hear about all the good things the Lord had done for Israel in rescuing them from the hand of the Egyptians. He said, "Praise be to the Lord, who rescued you from the hand of the Egyptians and of Pharaoh, and who rescued the people from the hands of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all other gods, for he did this to those who had treated Israel arrogantly." Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and other sacrifices to God, and Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat a meal with Moses' father-in-law in the presence of God. Jethro made up a name there. Jethro heard, he delighted, he acknowledged, he submitted. Jethro heard. He heard of all that God had done to save his people, to rescue his people from Pharaoh. But of course, and we've been saying this over and over again over the last few weeks, we're reminding ourselves that the slavery of Egypt and those plagues of judgment, the rescue from slavery and from judgment, the promise of a future land, yes, absolutely, those were historical events. But all of them point forward. They are all a picture of the rescue from slavery, the rescue from judgment that happened on the cross 1500 years later, which guarantees that those who believe in and follow and trust not Moses but Jesus have an eternity in paradise to look forward to. Jethro heard the story of rescue at the Red Sea and he delighted in it. But week in, week out, we remind ourselves of our rescue on the cross. That's what we do. I remind myself almost daily, God loves me, but I do not love him anywhere near adequately. Some of the stuff I still do, never mind think, sickens him. I have no place in his heaven. I cannot undo the things I have done in the past, and realistically I can't promise that I will be any better in the future, no matter how hard I try. And yet the Lord has rescued me. The judgment I deserve, he has taken on the cross. The promised land I have no place in, he has guaranteed me his place in it. So yes, Jethro delighted in the message of what God had done at the Red Sea. How much more have I cause to delight in what God has done for me? Jethro heard. Jethro delighted. Jethro acknowledged. Please note there is very definite language in verse 11. Verse 11, Jethro says very categorically, now I know that the Lord is greater than all other gods. We don't know that much, do we? As part of my General Synod work. I'm on a committee that advises on certain aspects of church finance nationally. This week I was in London, and we were asked to consider how things might change economically in a certain area over the next 5 years. And we laughed. We laughed very politely, but we laughed. We have no idea how things are going to turn out geopolitically, internationally, economically over the next 5 years. We have no idea what the future holds for us economically in the world over the next 5 years. Well, I don't. Even this coming week, I've got some idea of what this week holds for me. I know what's in the diary. But as someone said to me recently, everything in life can change on the turn of a sixpence. We know very little. But there is one thing I can know, because God has clearly and unambiguously and persistently revealed it to us. What is the one thing that we can know? It is this: the Lord is greater than all other gods. He is greater than anything else that I chase, anything else I try and rely on, anything else that I seek. No one else, nothing else will provide for me, will protect me, will give me purpose. Now I know, says Jethro. And so what did Jethro do? Well, he submitted to the Lord. He did it in a way that made sense to him. He expressed his submission by making an animal sacrifice. This animal that belongs to me, I'm giving to you. This life that belongs to me, I'm giving you a life here. Symbolizing the fact I'm giving you my life. That is what happens, isn't it, when we know that the Lord is God. When we know that the Lord is God, we say to him, I give you my life and everything in it. My life actually was always yours in the first place because you made it, so I'm going to stop pretending, in a sense. I'm going to stop pretending that my life is mine. I'm going to stop pretending that I know all that is best. I am joyfully going to surrender my life to you. But why is this story here? Yeah, it's a life-changing story for Jethro. It's actually an eternity-changing story for Jethro. But why is it here? Why is it so important that Moses has slotted it in for us? This is why it was so important. Because Jethro was what we call a Gentile. He was a non-Jew. He was not a child of Abraham. He was not in the chosen group that God had made promises to. He was a complete outsider who in God's goodness heard and delighted and acknowledged and submitted. Do you remember hundreds of years before, going back to the time of Abraham, do you remember what God promised Abraham? He promised Abraham 3 things. He said, you will have a numerous people. Well, now there are 2 million of them. He said, you will have a land. Well, the promised land is now in sight. And he said, and you guys will be a blessing to the nations, to outsiders. And of course now with Jethro, we're beginning to see that happen. The significance, therefore, of the story of Jethro, hugely significant, because it is no longer just a story of an old man in the desert 3,500 years ago. This now can be my story. This can be your story. This can be the guy you sit next to at Codger's story. An outsider becomes an insider. And so then, much more briefly, my second heading, a taste of heaven. Verse 12, I think that's what's going on here, isn't it? Verse 12, a taste of heaven. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and other sacrifices to God. And Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat a meal with Moses' father-in-law in the presence of God. In our extraordinarily stuffed up world, what is the one ingredient that is so missing? What is the one thing that we all deep down yearn for, we all long for, we all need? It is friendship and relationship and belonging. Friendship and relationship and belonging with one another, and friendship and relationship and belonging with our Heavenly Father. And that possibly is why the world still does Christmas. Because the world around us, as far as I can see, longs for just one day with no worries and no arguments and just fun and family and food. I think that's why the world does Christmas. Now, of course, where the world goes wrong is by thinking that the key to Christmas is to chuck money at it, and definitely the way to do Christmas is to eliminate Jesus from it. But their yearning is right, isn't it? Friendship and relationship and belonging, because by definition that eliminates hostility and fear and loneliness and isolation. And a meal in verse 12. We get meals, don't we? We get the importance of meals. Yes, as you well know, I like nice food as much as the next person, probably more than the next person. But meals aren't primarily about the extravagance of the food on the table. Meals primarily are about conversation and about relationship and friendship. Because that eliminates hostility and fear and loneliness and isolation. And that is why in the Bible, meals together are often a picture of heaven. That reading from Isaiah, you read there, the finest meat, the choicest of wine, that is about heaven. That is the passage I'm going to be preaching on this Thursday at my friend's funeral. Meals together are often a picture of heaven. I promise you, the new creation is not going to be about harps and angels and pink clouds, and if you're into that sort of music, boring music or naff music, that is not going to be heaven. Heaven is a physical place, or will be a physical place, just like here, where God will live face to face with his people. I have a question: how will he do that? How will he physically relate to millions of people personally at the same time? I have no idea how he's going to do that. But I know that he will. And I know that we will be together. And I know that we will belong. And I know we will eat. Verse 12. A meal in the desert. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and other sacrifices to God. And Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat a meal with Moses' father-in-law in the presence of God. How good is God? The Israelites rescued from slavery, but they're not yet in the promised land. And they see an outsider becoming an insider, and they get a taste of heaven in the middle of the desert. I really fear that some of us are missing out because we don't have really close Christian friends. I fear some of us are missing out on being a really good Christian friend. How do we make friends? Well, we all know how we make friends. We make friends by being friends. But of course our friendships are rooted in our friendship with God, and that's what holds our friendships together. I don't know if you've spotted this. Of course you've spotted it in one sense, but I don't know if you've spotted the significance of it quite in this way. Every Sunday at our 9 o'clock, probably half our Sundays at our 10:30, we do something really profound to help this friendship, relationship, belonging thing. What do? Together we eat a meal. We eat bread, we drink wine together around the Lord's table. We don't call it an altar because sacrifices don't take place there. But we gather around the Lord's dining table and we eat a meal together symbolically. We share bread and wine in his presence. The roller coaster of Exodus, Jethro, he heard, he delighted, he acknowledged, he submitted, and then he ate with God's people in God's presence. The roller coaster of life that we live until we reach the promised land. This only ever occurred to me yesterday. Do you know, on a Sunday, I think we try and be Jethros on a Sunday, don't we? In a moment, as we gather at the Lord's table, we're going to be Jethros. We are going to hear and delight in God's great rescue. We're going to acknowledge, now I know the Lord is God. Now I know I've been chasing the wrong thing. We're going to submit to him. And then in God's goodness, we're going to taste heaven together. Our communion service, the Bible doesn't call it a communion service. I don't really know why we do. The Bible simply calls it the Lord's Supper. And in a sense, it is a meal in the desert. It's there, it's designed to nourish us in our relationship with God and nourish us in our relationship with one another. It's there to equip us for our ongoing trek through the desert as we wait for the day when God gives us entry into his promised land. As we seek to be a blessing to many other outsiders longing that they become insiders. Exodus 18, a bit of an anticlimax. Exodus 18 is no anticlimax. Exodus 18 is actually what we long for in this life. What do we long for? We long for outsiders to become insiders, and we long to periodically experience a taste of heaven together until our work on earth is done.